We are talking today with Naomi Oreskes. Naomi Oreskes is one of the world's leading historians of science. She is professor of history and science studies at the University of California, San Diego, and adjunct professor of geosciences at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Her research focuses on consensus and dissent in science. She has won numerous prizes for her work and has lectured widely in diverse venues, ranging from the Madison, Wisconsin Civics Club to the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory. Her 2004 essay, The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, cited by Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, led to op-ed pieces in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and to congressional testimony in the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. And she's here to talk about her book, Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco to Global Warming, co-authored with Eric Conway. So start out, tell us, what was your motivation in writing your book, Merchants of Doubt?
Well, it wasn't so much motivation as kind of getting drawn into it. Eric Conway and I fell upon this story by accident. I'm a historian of science. I was working on the history of oceanography, and through my work on oceanography, I had come to learn about the work of oceanographers like Roger Revelle and Dave Keeling, who in the 1950s had first begun to do serious research related to the question of climate change caused by greenhouse gases. And meanwhile, Eric Conway is a historian of science as well, who was working on the history of atmospheric science. He had been writing a book on the history of atmospheric science research at NASA, and so had come across a lot of the research related to the ozone hole. And more or less independently, we had discovered that the same people who were challenging the scientific evidence of climate change had also challenged the scientific evidence of the ozone hole. So Eric and I met at a conference, we started talking, and we thought, well, that's a little weird. Why would the same people be challenging the data on both of these issues? So we started digging in a little deeper and found, well, it wasn't just global warming and the ozone hole. They had actually challenged the scientific evidence related to acid rain as well and nuclear winter. And then we dug a little deeper and we found that, in fact, they had challenged the scientific evidence related to the harms of tobacco and had in fact worked with the tobacco industry. And at that point, Eric and I looked at each other and we thought, we have to tell this story.
So who were these people that you discovered?
Well, so the story revolves around four key scientists, and they were scientists. They weren't climate scientists or oncologists or epidemiologists. They were physicists who had built their careers in the Cold War, working on Cold War weapons and rocketry programs. They were quite prominent and distinguished people who had risen to positions of power and influence in American science and science policy. And they were virulently anti-communist. And in the early 1980s, they were working together on a scientific advisory committee to the Reagan administration on the question of the Strategic Defense Initiative. So as you may remember, Ronald Reagan wanted to build a missile shield, sometimes also referred to as Star Wars, to protect the United States from incoming Soviet missiles. The American scientific community reacted very strongly against that idea, saying that it was technologically dubious, that it would be wildly expensive to even try to make this thing work, and it probably wouldn't work. You'd spend all this money, and in the end it probably wouldn't work. And also that it was a bad idea politically because it was destabilizing, because it was a departure from the Cold War doctrine of MAD, mutual assured destruction, which is how we had kept the peace for, 40 years, 30, 40 years. Because both sides knew that if either one launched a first strike, we'd all be wiped out. It would be Armageddon, and it was in no one's interest to start a third world war. But the Reagan administration started talking about a winnable nuclear war. That was extremely upsetting to scientists, including especially scientists in the weapons community, who accepted the doctrine of mutual assured destruction and really believed that the work that they had done had kept the peace through this doctrine. So the idea of disrupting that was very disturbing. 6,500 American scientists signed a petition objecting to the Strategic Defense Initiative and declaring a boycott of the program. The key players in our story, Robert Jastrow, Frederick Seitz, and Bill Nierenberg, created the George C. Marshall Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., to defend SDI and to claim that that the debate was still open, that the scientific community didn't agree, and to demand equal time in the press for their view supporting SDI. And so even though 6,500 American scientists had opposed SDI, and 3 physicists supported it, Jastrow and Nirenberg were able to make it seem as if there was a debate that was more or less equal and opposite, and to persuade journalists like yourself, well, maybe not journalists like you, but other journalists, to give them equal time. And this was the beginning then of this story that then they began to do the same thing for the issue of nuclear winter, acid rain, the ozone hole, secondhand smoke, and global warming. And in the book, what we show is, well, we ask the question, where did they get the idea for that tactic of demanding equal time? Well, Frederick Seitz, who was the original chairman of the board of the Marshall Institute, had worked for the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company and had actually learned this strategy working for the tobacco industry, who had first developed this strategy of doubt-mongering and demanding equal time for the other side.
So it was these 3 or 4 guys that are the merchants here?
Exactly. And so there's the 3 who created the Marshall Institute, originally the 3 founders, and then a 4th physicist who joined them a few years later, but a similar kind of personal biography of having worked on Cold War rocketry programs.
So where did their funding come from for starting the Marshall Institute?
Well, it's a very interesting story because, of course, most people assume this is a story of overt corruption, people being bought out by the fossil fuel industry, and actually that's not the story. Initially, when they created the Marshall Institute, they received no money from corporate supporters at all. In fact, Robert Jastrow was quite strategic about this. He didn't want to take money from corporations because he felt that would be used against them to say that they were just shills of industry. And so initially, well, they worked on a pretty modest budget initially. A lot of what they did was just the 3 of them writing letters to editors, calling journalists, writing white papers that they would then send to media outlets and say, this is our position, threatening editors when they didn't give them equal time, threatening to sue. And in many cases, the threat of a lawsuit was sufficient to do the job. So they didn't actually have to hire lawyers. They didn't actually have to sue. They just had to threaten to sue. So we talk in the book about one successful example where the threat of a lawsuit caused a number of public radio stations to pull a show on SDI that they had been planning to air. And Jastrow boasts about this to his colleagues. So initially, they didn't need a lot of money. They worked pretty modestly, and what money they did have came from foundations, from conservative and libertarian foundations. So they solicited funds from the Olin Foundation, Scaife Richardson, Joseph Coors, and a whole set of very conservative, right-leaning, libertarian, free market-type foundations. Now, in later years, that shifted, and today the Marshall Institute is a very large recipient of industry funding, as are many of the other think tanks that since that time have joined into this campaign.
And did you have a sense that these 3 actually believed in what they were promoting?
Yes, exactly. And I think what's very interesting and actually important about this book, I think they believed it absolutely, and I think that's part of where kind of the passion and the fury of it comes from, in a way. It's not really a story of corruption. It is a story of error. It's a story of a kind of overconfidence and a kind of arrogance born out of the Cold War. But it's not really a story of corruption exactly. I think that Jastrow, Nirenberg, and Seitz all believed passionately that the Soviet Union was a serious threat to the United States. I think they believed passionately that the work that they had done in the Cold War kept us free. And I think they believe passionately that, what's the line, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance? They used to like to quote that all the time. And part of their defense of strategic defense was the idea that this was part of the eternal vigilance to protect our liberty. The pathology in the story is not that they were anti-communist. They may or may not have been right about the Soviet threat. The pathology is what happens when the Cold War ends. So they create the Marshall Institute in 1984. The Cold War ends only 5 years later, and that's a surprise to most people. I mean, the Berlin Wall came down very suddenly, and the end of the Cold War happened much more rapidly than most observers expected or predicted. So I think it kind of takes them aback, and I think they're a little bit at a loss for what to do with themselves. They spend their whole life fighting, the Soviet menace, the communist threat, and suddenly it's evaporated. And if they were really rational, they might have just said, great, pop open the champagne, we won the Cold War, great, and we won the Cold War, and it was partly because of what scientists had done. So you might think that they would have been happy. But I think, maybe this is the pathology of a life spent fighting, that they actually just couldn't stop fighting. And so they find a new enemy. And we see this very interesting transition. I find it quite significant that the very first report they write attacking the scientific evidence of climate change is in 1989, the very year when the Berlin Wall comes down. So the new enemy is environmentalism. And they began to accuse environmentalists of exaggerating environmental threats in order to justify what they think is a socialist agenda. So they basically make environmentalists the new set of reds under the bed. And they start to talk about environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. And to see the environmental demand for government regulation as a form of creeping communism. And then that idea then spreads very widely in the right-wing and conservative side of the American political spectrum. So today we see that argument being made explicitly by people like Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, who routinely accuse environmentalists of being communists, accuse me of being a communist. And it's so bizarre. I mean, you feel like the Cold War ended, more than 20 years ago, and we're still fighting the Cold War, but in a way we are. In a way, this is the sort of perplexity of this story, is that this is a legacy of the Cold War.
Trying to remember, because I know going way back that environmentalists there were claims that they were infiltrated by the Soviets and that they were being funded by communists.
Right, and there was never actually any evidence to support that claim. And one of the things we talk about in the book, one of the things I often talk about when we lecture, is that this really is a kind of paranoia on their part, because the environmental movement in the United States was not created by leftists. It was created by progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, the head of the Forest Service, who was a Yale plutocrat, an aristocrat from the Northeast, and of course John D. Rockefeller, who was one of the greatest proponents of the National Park System. The Grand Tetons, were really the baby of John D. Rockefeller. Hardly a communist, right? So I mean, it's a very weird projection of a certain kind of Cold War anti-communist anxiety onto a group of people whose historical roots are actually not left-wing at all. But the way it makes sense to these people is over the issue of government regulation. So what happens is that throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there's actually a lot of bipartisan support in the United States for environmental protection. And actually, historically, the Republican Party had a stronger record on environmental protection than the Democrats had. But that shifted around the time of the Reagan administration. So it shifted right around the same time that this debate over SDI is taking place, and it shifts right around the same time that these men create the Marshall Institute. And environmentalism begins to become more of a left-wing issue, really after the Nixon administration, because of the issue of regulation. Because now it becomes no longer an issue of land conservation and land preservation, such as setting aside the Grand Tetons, which was John D. Rockefeller's great dream. But it becomes a matter of regulating business activity, regulating pollution. So things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, Environmental Policy Act. Many of these acts give the government the authority to regulate business activity because of pollution. And that begins to then realign the politics of this debate, that the business community in America, supported by not all Republicans, because Richard Nixon created the EPA and signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but the kind of hard right wing of the Republican Party begins to align itself against environmentalism and against regulation, and to say that regulation is part of a kind of overweening, expansive, overly intrusive government telling us what to do with our lives, controlling the marketplace. And so they begin to vilify environmentalists, and this is where they then make the link to communism, that once you allow the government to intervene in the marketplace, whether it's to control tobacco smoke or acid emissions from coal plants, it's only a matter of time before we're on the slippery slope to socialism and tyranny.
Okay, so as the title of your book, Merchants of Doubt, implies, that these guys are pushing doubt out there. Is it primarily in the scientific community, or is it with the public that they're trying to...
Well, the target is the public, but they use science. So all of the things we've just talked about, the issue of the appropriate role of government, business, the marketplace, regulation, these are all legitimate political questions, and one could have an honest and legitimate political debate about the appropriate role of government regulation and where to draw the line and how much regulation is appropriate. Those are all legitimate. But they didn't do that. They didn't say, let's talk honestly about what we know about regulation and when it works and when it doesn't work, or how to make an effective regulation that isn't overly intrusive. Instead of doing that, they attack the science. So this is the part of it that becomes sort of dishonest, right? They attack the science because they know public opinions polls clearly show that if people think the science is unsettled, then they will think it's premature to be proposing regulations. So one of the most effective ways that you can stop regulation is to convince the public that the science is unsettled. And this was the core of the tobacco strategy. This is what the tobacco industry had begun to do going back to the 1950s. They had realized that if they could convince the American people that we didn't really know for sure whether or not tobacco was dangerous, then the American public would continue to smoke. And they wouldn't want the government telling them not to. So the tobacco industry develops this strategy in the 1950s. They do it very consciously. They do it with the help of a public relations firm, Hill & Knowlton. There are millions of pages of documents that attest to this, many of which we read. Our eyes are worse now for having to read all this stuff. And they, of course, were part of the basis of the prosecution of the tobacco industry in the United States by the U.S. Department of Justice under the racketeering and corrupt organization statutes. So the tobacco industry was, in fact, found guilty in the United States of criminal conspiracy to commit fraud against the American people because of these activities that they began in the 1950s, because of this doubt-mongering campaign. And it was an extremely clever campaign because very rarely did they actually lie straight up. And one of the wonderful documents I found was a tobacco industry document giving guidelines, pointers for experts. And one of the pointers was, don't lie, you don't have to. Because what they understood, and it's very clever, it's very savvy, you don't have to lie. You don't have to say tobacco is safe. All you have to say is, well, we're not really sure. You know, cancer is a very complicated disease. There are many different causes of cancer, and the experts don't all agree. Why don't we just do some more research? And of course, to an innocent person who doesn't know what's going on, doesn't know that this is actually a strategy developed by a public relations firm, it sounds pretty reasonable. And of course, this is the strategy that we still hear today about global warming. We hear people say, well, I'm not really sure, I'm an agnostic. You know, this is one of my favorite ones, I'm an agnostic. Well, to be an agnostic in the face of 50 years of overwhelming scientific data, that should be suspicious to people. That should be fishy. But of course, if you don't realize what's going on, you know, you say, well, yeah, well, maybe we really do need to do a little more work on this.
All right. So what other strategies do they employ as well? Are they looking at expanding beyond just their institute to the creation of other institutes? Or?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things. Okay, so the key strategy is doubt-mongering. And developing these doubt-mongering strategies. The second part of the strategy is recruiting science, or recruiting scientists, because one of the things the tobacco industry recognized early on was that if a tobacco industry executive said, well, you know, we're not convinced of the science, most of us wouldn't be so credulous, you know, that we would believe a tobacco industry executive, and certainly journalists wouldn't buy that. But if they could recruit scientists to say it, then many people would believe it. And so the tobacco industry, at one point, they had a project called Project White Coat, which was all about recruiting scientists to be experts. So that's a key part of the strategy, too. So, and you see this again today. You'll hear if you turn on the radio, and it's not just Fox News, you see this on a lot of mainstream media as well, someone who will say, well, I'm a scientist, but I don't think global warming is happening. But if you actually scratch the surface and say, well, what kind of a scientist are you? You very often find, not even very often, you almost always find that they're not climate scientists. Sometimes they're scarcely even scientists at all. I mean, sometimes they're podiatrists or dentists, you know, or optometrists, right? I mean, there are people who have credentials that are completely irrelevant to the actual scientific question at hand. But most people don't make that distinction. Most journalists don't make that distinction. So these people get on TV or on the radio and say, I'm a scientist. So that's part two. And then part three is money. So, as we said a moment ago, initially the Marshall Institute did not accept money from the fossil fuel industry, but that begins to change in the 1990s when the fossil fuel industry realizes that they can make common cause with the Marshall Institute and a whole bunch of other think tanks that are committed to free market principles. So they begin to funnel money into the Marshall Institute, the Heartland Institute, the Cato Institute. There's a whole set of these think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. There's actually a long laundry list of these groups, Frontiers of Freedom, the Acton Institute, I mean, it kind of goes on and on and on. And so a lot of corporate money begins to flow into these institutes. Some of the money comes from the fossil fuel industry, some of the money comes from the tobacco industry, And one of the things that was most shocking to me in writing this book was to discover how many things the tobacco industry had funded that had nothing to do with tobacco. The tobacco industry realized that they were going to be regulated, they were going to be heavily taxed, so they began to fund all kinds of different organizations that fought taxation and regulation for whatever reasons. So it turns out that in California, where we of course famously have Proposition 13, which greatly limited the capacity of municipalities to raise property taxes, the tobacco industry gave a substantial amount of this financial support for Proposition 13. We found one document in the archives, which is reproduced in the book, which was a document listing Philip Morris Philanthropy for the year 1995. They were not giving money to the Fresh Air Fund. This so-called philanthropy was a laundry list of support for all kinds of different think tanks, including many of the ones I just mentioned, many grassroots anti-tax organizations, grassroots or supposedly grassroots anti-regulatory organizations, organizations promoting free market economics, organizations promoting, let's say, fair economics, free market fundamentalism, neoliberalism, a whole kind of host of different ideologies, all kind of based on promoting the free market. And this was my favorite one. This was actually a eureka moment for me before we sort of quite got the whole ideological structure behind this. The Ludwig von Mises Cultural Foundation. Now, have you ever heard of Ludwig? Right. I mean, most people haven't, neither had I. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, who the heck is Ludwig von Mises? Well, Ludwig von Mises was an Austrian aristocrat, and he's considered to be the founder of modern neoliberalism, the set of economic principles based on the idea of minimizing government intervention in the marketplace, kind of harking back to Adam Smith, John Locke, kind of the classic liberal thinkers, and emphasizing the right of the individual to decide for him or herself. Well, of course, the tobacco industry loved this because the tobacco industry used to always argue that, you know, smoking is an individual right. It's your right as an individual to decide whether you want to smoke or not. So when I saw that the tobacco industry was funding the Ludwig von Mises Cultural Foundation, then I kind of got it, right? That there's all this support for neoliberal ideology because it is rather convenient for the tobacco industry, it's rather convenient for the coal utilities, it's rather convenient for the entire fossil fuel industry, and it's rather convenient for people who don't want to see regulation to stop global warming.
One of the things one often hears in, at least in letters to the editor, is in response to global warming as well, there's a list somewhere of 50,000 scientists who have signed on saying that global warming is a hoax.
Right. Well, first of all, it's not 50,000, but right. And there was this Oregon petition project that was organized by a chemist named Art Robinson, and exactly right. I mean, a petition supposedly signed by thousands of scientists, but a number of people have looked into that. There was no checking of the credentials of any of these people. It turned out the Spice Girls had signed on this so-called petition. And even if they actually were scientists, the whole notion of a petition is actually sort of preposterous because science doesn't proceed by petitions. I mean, the very fact that they did a petition is really proof that it's political, right? A petition is a political tool to lobby your government or petition an authority. Science doesn't proceed by petitions. Science proceeds by collecting data and presenting evidence at scientific conferences, subjecting that evidence to the critical scrutiny of colleagues, submitting it to peer review, and then ultimately publishing it in peer-reviewed journals where it can be scrutinized by anyone who wishes to read it. That's how science actually operates. And so if you want to know what the scientific evidence is, you need to go to the peer-reviewed literature, which is, of course, exactly what I did when I first started this project, and I was trying to understand what scientists had to say about this issue. If you look at the studies that have been done of the peer-reviewed literature, of which mine in 2004 was the first one, but there have been several since, they all come to the same conclusion, that in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, there is essentially no debate that climate change is underway and that it's largely driven by human activities, just as there is essentially no debate that tobacco is deadly. The reality of global warming is just about as settled now as the reality of the harms of tobacco. But you wouldn't know that from the way it's covered in the press.
The Marshall Institute, are those three founders of it, are they still involved with challenging climate change?
Well, unless they're doing it up in heaven or somewhere else. They're deceased now, but there's a new generation of people who have continued. And of course, that's part of the story, is that the original founders have passed on, but they've handed over the baton to a whole set of new people, including a man by the name of Willie Soon at the Harvard-Smithsonian Observatory. And just a couple of days ago, a big report was released by Greenpeace about his funding, and evidently, according to Greenpeace, he's received over $1 million in funding from the fossil fuel industry. So actually, I would say this latest generation of climate skeptics, contrarians, and deniers are actually less scrupulous about their sources of funding and more overtly in the pay of the fossil fuel industry than the first generation were.
So is it easier to follow them now if you just follow the money?
I think it is, actually. I think in some ways, because it's become more overt, it actually is easier to follow, yes.
Talk more about the use of the media and leveraging that. And it sounds like you mentioned, I think, Hilton Knowlton previously.
Yes,
Are they leveraging PR firms as well?
Right, exactly. So there's sort of two main strategies there. So initially, the doubt-mongering strategy developed by the tobacco industry was developed in concert with a public relations firm, Hill & Knowlton. When the first scientific evidence, the first conclusive scientific evidence that tobacco caused cancer came out in 1953, the heads of the tobacco industry actually met with John Hill, the chief of Hill & Knowlton, to develop a strategy, to figure out what to do. And the strategy they developed was this idea of challenging the scientific data. So they pursued that strategy over the course of 50 years, 5 decades. But they also, I just forgot what the question was. Sorry.
Oh, using
the
use
day.
of, no,
oh gosh.
The use of
the media,
firms,
right,
yeah.
Exactly. So the initial strategy was to challenge the scientific evidence, initially by recruiting scientists to participate. But then they also began to develop a strategy of targeting the media. And the key to targeting the media was the idea of fair and balanced coverage, that the media owed it to their listeners to present a balanced appraisal of the situation and to present both sides. So the tobacco industry would develop press releases, white papers, reports. Some of these reports were written to look like they were scientific papers and reports. Sometimes they would actually hire doctors to either help write the reports or to sign their names to it. And then they would distribute these pamphlets very, very widely to editors, to journalists. They would mail thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of copies of these to journalists across America. And in the book, we tell about a few examples of journalists who received these materials and actually wrote thank you notes to the tobacco industry for sending them these very instructive and illuminating materials, and even saying things like, I didn't understand this issue, and I'm really happy to, have now this other side of the issue. And even Edward R. Murrow, I mean, there's a lot of things in the book that are kind of heartbreaking, but for me, one of the really heartbreaking moments was when I found that Edward R. Murrow had been sucked into this and actually presented a balanced view of the tobacco issue in the 1950s. So there's a kind of supply side approach here, which is to supply journalists with this alternative. But there's also a kind of demand side as well, which is pressure. And the Marshall Institute then really takes this up in a big way in the 1980s, and we see this strategy then being used throughout the 1980s, 90s, and up to the present day, that if journalists don't give equal time to their views, they pressure them. They call them up, they demand equal time, and they invoke the fairness doctrine, and they say, well, the fairness doctrine requires you to give us equal time for our views. And of course, this is a perversion of the fairness doctrine, because the fairness doctrine does not require journalists to propagate falsehoods. It doesn't require you to defend slavery or give equal time to the Nazis, right? But this is essentially the strategy they used, and it was very, very effective. It was shockingly effective. And why it was, I think, is a question for journalists to discuss among themselves.
So much of the corporate media now appears to be owned by many of the same players that are benefiting from these tactics. Was that true back when this first started with the tobacco industry and or SDI?
Yeah, we don't, we're not experts on the media, and in the book we don't really talk that much about that question, but I think it has changed. I mean, a lot of people have written on the changing media landscape. The main thing we see in the early parts of the story is simply the pressure on journalists. And some people have argued that journalists, major newspapers went along with it because of advertising, because tobacco advertising was such a big tobacco advertising was a big client for major magazines and newspapers, and that may really have played a role. But in our research, it seemed like it was actually something less crude than that, and more subtle and in some ways more disturbing, was that the journalists did, in fact, they wanted to be objective. They wanted to be balanced. And so the strategy was effective in a way because it wasn't crude. It was effective because it tapped into journalists' own value system, the value of objectivity, the value of fairness, the value of balance. These are all good things. So they take those good things and then they exploit them. They say, well, don't you want to be fair? Don't you want to be objective? Don't you want to be balanced? And most journalists say, well, of course I do. I'm committed to being fair. I'm committed to being objective. But that then gets used to manipulate them into presenting these views, which are either just false, just flat out demonstrably false in many cases, or in some cases not false but misleading, misrepresentative, or extreme minority views being presented as if they're mainstream.
So how much of this would you say, of the blame of this, lies at the feet of journalists and the media itself for not asking tougher questions or being ignorant of the science?
Yeah. Well, there's sins of omissions and sins of commission, right? So I think the principal responsibility has to be on the perpetrators. The people who consciously and deliberately did these things are the people who, to my mind, have the lion's share of the blame. To some extent, I think that journalists were victims, although I do think that it is the job of a journalist to ask tough questions. So it's a little shocking to me how many journalists don't seem to have asked even some fairly rudimentary questions about expertise and funding that if they had asked, might have, raised a little bit of a red flag that something fishy was going on. So I think journalists could have been tougher. I think scientists should have spoken out more to object when, one of the things we do say in the book that we do talk about is that in many cases the scientific community saw what was going on but didn't really intervene. And when we interviewed scientists and we asked some leading scientists, well, why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you say something about this? And they said, well, we knew it was garbage, so we just ignored it. So one of the things we say in the book is, well, one of the lessons of history and environmentalism is that garbage doesn't go away, right? You dump garbage in the bay, it's in the bay. You dump garbage in the ocean, it ends up in the Pacific Gyre, right? So the idea that you could just ignore it because it's garbage, I think we know now that that strategy is not effective. But at the time, when people didn't quite realize how systematic this whole thing was becoming, they thought they could just ignore it. And they didn't want to get dragged into the mud. There were also cases where lots of wild accusations were being flung, merchants of doubt making a lot of accusations against scientists, and it felt like mudslinging. So a lot of scientists said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to get engaged in that. But part of the problem with that is that, the public hear these accusations, and if they don't hear a cogent response, then a lot of people will think, oh, well, those guys were accused of manipulating data, they were accused of fudging data, they were accused of, hiding the decline. And if you don't hear a good answer to why those accusations are false, then the accusations have a tendency to stick. So I think scientists could have done more to stand up. I think journalists could have done more to ask tough questions. And then, of course, there's all of us, right? I think all of us, in some sense, have gone along with this because, at the end of the day, the doubt mongers were telling us a story we wanted to hear. They were telling us, oh, tobacco's okay, you can keep smoking. Acid rain, no big deal. Don't worry about burning lots of coal, which is a good, cheap energy fuel. The ozone hole, no big deal. Keep using your hairspray. Global warming, we don't have to change the way we live. Everything's fine. Don't worry, be happy. So in every case, their story is kind of the good news story, and the scientist story is the bad news story. So if you had to choose, which would you prefer? Most of us would rather hear good news. So I think to some extent we've all gone along with this because we would all rather, we say this in the book, we would all rather live in a world that didn't have global warming, right? Life would be a whole lot easier if we didn't have to worry about these problems. So to some extent we all go along with it. So to some extent we're all involved in this story.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us today.
Well, thank you.